point to land use mixing as allowing us to achieve compact urban development and reduce rural land consumption. And public health field looks to a number of different benefits, but one of which is the improvement in feasibility and attractiveness by diminishing physical barriers to walking that comes out of improving the land use mix of a neighborhood. And so, more specifically, the motivation of this dissertation research was to examine the connections between land use mixing and walking. However, I would argue that this connection, although celebrated, remains somewhat convoluted. And that's because there are a host of different measures that we typically adopt to evaluate the effectiveness of smart growth policies in their relationship to pedestrian travel. And ultimately, without some clear guidance onto what the most appropriate measure is to evaluate this transportation land use connection, we have the possibility to misguide policy by adopting land use mix measures that have empirical theoretical foundations. And so this motivation led to a bigger research problem that I want to examine through the course of these 3 empirical studies that I'll be presenting, which is that practice remains somewhat guided by limited theory and empirical evidence that substantiates this connection between land use mix as a built environment measure and also a transportation performance metric. And so then the objective specifically was to provide research and practice with an improved conceptualization and empirical measure of land use mix and studying this connection. And I focused particularly on pedestrian travel for this research. Okay, and then I subdivided it to sort of address this larger overarching research question into 3 specific questions that I addressed with individual studies. And so the first question that this research looked into is, what is the relationship between pedestrian travel and land use mix when the complementarity, composition, and configuration of local land use types is considered? And I'll go into greater detail when I go through these studies sequentially as to what those complementarity, composition, configuration mean. In my second study, or the second question I'm looking at, I want to study what is the impact of land use mix and other related smart growth features on pedestrian travel. But I want to divide it into 2 different trip purposes. So I want to look at transportation-related trip purposes and also discretionary travel, so travel for recreation. And finally, having sort of looked at these 2 questions, I wanted to examine how we incorporate geographic scale into measuring the built environment. So how does operationalizing land use mix and other built environment features at different spatial extents influence this hypothesized transportation land use connection? And so then, in the first study that I'll go over here in the next slide, entitled An Activity-Related Land Use Mix Construct and Its Connection to Pedestrian Travel, I sort of dug deep into that first question. So I intend to present a land use mix measure that reflects a conceptually valid set of indicators, and I would want to base this into some sort of theory. And so I used activity-based transportation and landscape ecology theory to inform the development of this measure. And then the second study, entitled A Pathway Linking Smart Growth Neighborhoods to Home-Based Pedestrian Travel, I want to investigate the relative contribution of land use mix and other smart growth factors on the decision to walk within a greater sort of multi-directional conceptual framework that I propose. And then finally, the third study, which is operationalizing the neighborhood effects of the built environment and travel behavior, I explore this question of geographic scale in greater detail. So, to dig into the first empirical study of the 3 that I will present, this work is published in Environment and Planning B, as Lisa mentioned, and I've looked at addressing this question of what's the relationship between walking and land use mix when we measure land use mix based upon these different aspects of complementarity, composition, and configuration. And so, in a previous article that kind of came from the literature review of this work, I categorized land use mix measures into 3 different categories. And so there's distance-based accessibility measures. And so these simply look at what's the distance between your home location or a trip origin and a trip destination. So it takes you a quarter mile to get to the nearest grocery store. There's a lot of shortcomings with this as a mixed measure. So then a second category of measures are these intensity measures. And so how many retail or how many grocery stores are there within a quarter mile of my home location. But arguably, when we think about measuring land use mix, we're really kind of trying to think about all the different land uses in an area. And so this is sort of a measure of pattern or pattern aspects of land use mixing. And so these can be then subdivided further into this notion of land use composition. So what's the contribution of different land uses or the composition of different land uses within a neighborhood. Or what hasn't really been looked at is this notion of configuration. So how are they actually spatially arranged within a neighborhood? And so if we're looking at the y-axis on this schematic here, we have land use composition, and as you go up the axis, you get from simple to complex representations. And so landscape A has, in the lower left-hand corner here, has 2 land use types that are evenly divided. However, if we add complexity in composition, based index that are used don't really incorporate this notion of configuration. And so we know that if we look at the landscape C and landscape D, that this seems to be a much more integrated land use mixing. And so this is really what we're trying to get at when we think of land use mixing. And we can't get at it unless we incorporate configuration measures, which are typically all but missing from current practice. So the objective of this study was to introduce a land use mix measure that quantified these 2 different pattern aspects of composition and configuration by using some sort of underpinning theories, and then connecting it to pedestrian travel. So I want to demonstrate this link of a multifaceted construct. And the travel outcomes that I looked at were walk mode choice and walk trip frequency. And so for this first study, I chose a pretty expensive study area. So looking at the Willamette Valley, I looked at 6 counties here in Oregon, and I gathered tax lot data that was provided to me by the MPOs and the local jurisdictions for 900,000 parcels of land within that study area. And then to further add complexity to it all, I created a fishnet and casted it across the entire study area of 66-foot edge grid cells. And so then I could allocate land uses to 65 million different grid cells in my region. So a pretty computationally intensive endeavor, but produced a really rich land use data set. And I was able to complement this with additional data on other built environment attributes pertaining to density. So I used US Census information and information from the longitudinal employer household dynamics data set, and then design features calculated by using Tiger files. And then to link this to transportation, I was fortunate enough that when I began my dissertation endeavor, or began my PhD program, the Oregon Household Travel and Activity Survey was released. And so this is a 1-day travel diary that was collected between 2009 and 2011 within the region. And it was within my study area. It's sort of a sample of travel information for 14,000 adults from about 8,700 households. So linking this together became a very rich transportation land use data set to examine. And so the analytic plan then were to first measure land use mix, as I mentioned. And so before I could really delve into what were the measures that I wanted to look at, I needed to have some sort of overarching category that was consistent for how we classify. And so I used the American Planning Association's land-based classification standards based upon function. So all of those 900,000 parcels were assigned to one of 9 different land use types. And then since land use mix is a neighborhood effect, I had to aggregate up these cells. And so I aggregated them up to 3 different geographies for this first study, looking at quarter-mile grid cells, half-mile grid cells, and 1-mile grid cells. And then to sort of build this land use mix construct, I performed a confirmatory factor analysis, and then I assigned the predicted factor scores back to these 3 different neighborhood grid cells. And then I brought it into walk mode choice and a walk trip frequency models. And I did that because I wanted to be able to compare what's the additional contribution that my land use mix construct has on these walking behaviors when compared to the entropy index, which as a composition measure tends to sort of be the standard bearer of how researchers measure land use mixing, but it has a lot of inherent flaws within it. And so let's go through the 4 different indicators that shook out from the confirmatory factor analysis in this first study. So land use mix was reflective of, first, a sort of a unique contribution of this work is that I introduced this new composition measure, which I entitled an activity-related complementarity mix measure, an indicator that represent the balance of local land use types within a neighborhood, but it was based on derived travel rather than spatial equilibrium. So the big fault of, or one of the biggest faults of the entropy index is that there's this equal balance assumption that's inherent to it. So if we have a neighborhood that has 3 land use types, for instance, residential, retail, and maybe industrial. A perfect land use mix, so forth, would be based upon having 1/3 of each of those land use types, but there's no really underpinning theory as to why that would influence any sort of travel behavior. So what I did is I looked at all the travel patterns within the OHAS data set, and I produced weights that were based upon where individuals were traveling to. And so this allowed me to propose a different balance as to what would be an ideal balance of land use mixing. And then a second composition indicator for this land use mix construct was another tenet of sort of smart growth development, which is increased residential and retail patch richness. So having lots of localized developments of retail within a neighborhood. And then, as I pointed to, these are just composition measures, but you need to also get at sort of the spatial arrangement of land uses in an area. So one indicator that got at that was this idea of a maximum patch size. And so if you're going to have a mix of land uses, you can't have one contiguous parcel of land use within it. It's just not possible to really have that integration or pixelated diagram that I had in that landscape D in the upper right-hand corner if you have just one big, large land use within there. And then borrowing from landscape ecology research, a fourth indicator was predicted by this land use mix construct, and this is the contagion index. And so this indicator represented the interspersion and dissimilarity of adjacent pixels. So it really gets at what that upper right-hand corner schematic I had shown in that diagram, where you have that really sort of pixelated view of different land uses. So it gets at the spatial arrangements and that there's dissimilarity amongst the different land use types in the neighborhood. And so I estimated these at the 3 different geographic extents, and I had a really good model fit, which was promising. So I went forward with predicting these. And so this is just showing a figure showing what it looked like within the urban areas of Portland, Salem, and Eugene. And the darker the color, the greater the land use mixing based upon this construct. And so just ground truthing it, it looks like it's a pretty valid measure of land use mix. Okay. And so then having those predicted scores, I brought it into a walk mode choice model. So I wanted to look at the decision to walk. And so first I estimated a base model that had socio-demographic and economic attributes of the individual and their household, and then also a measurement of trip distance. And then I wanted to, on this base model, test first what's the additional explanatory power that's provided by the land use entropy, so sort of the standard measure of land use mixing. And I found that the quarter-mile grid cell, this had a non-significant relationship once you accounted for these other covariates. However, when I looked at the quarter-mile and included my land use mix construct, I found that this built environment measure had a positive and significant association with the decision to walk. And this pattern held true for the half-mile grid cell and 1-mile grid cell. And so it started to point towards the idea that this land use mix construct, at least in this context, was a stronger predictor of the decision to walk. And then wanting to look at another travel behavior, I looked at walk trip frequency at the home location, so the number of home-based walk trips. Again, estimated a base model, including socio-demographic and economic attributes. But this time, I wanted to hold other built environment measures as covariates. And so I used 2 density measures and 2 design measures. And then I looked at what's the additional explanatory power of my construct. So again, at the quarter-mile, half-mile, and 1-mile grid cells, I found that after you account for all these other predictors of this outcome, the land use mix construct had a positive and significant association. So all this points to sort of a headed in the right direction, in that this measure of land use mix that I provided here seems to have some legs to it, so to speak. Okay, and so the study findings from this first study, there's a number of them, and so I'll just point to a couple of the contributions, one of which is that I developed a land use mix construct that reflects both land use pattern aspects, so looking at composition and configuration, which has been overlooked. I introduced an activity-related complementarity measure based on derived travel demand. And then what I found within the empirical test there at the end of the models is that the construct was a stronger predictor of walk mode choice than the entropy index, and that the construct also significantly predicted home-based walk trip frequency when I was accounting for those other built environment attributes. And so there's a number of probably practical implications from this first study, but one of which I'd like to point to is just that I believe that through this work I've extended the conceptualization of land use mix And that by doing so, this can help inform smart growth and infill development plans as to what the proper balance of activities may be if we're looking to achieve walkability. So if there's a opportunity within an urban landscape for infill or to develop a new green space, that having this metric, you can now kind of get a sense of what land use type is missing from the neighborhood if the outcome we're looking for is an increase in the walkability of an area. Okay, so that was the first study. And so the second study, which is a pathway linking smart growth neighborhoods to home-based pedestrian travel. I bring this into a greater conceptual framework. And this work has been published in the Journal Travel Behavior and Society. And with both of these articles, please just contact me after the webinar and I'd be more than willing to share them with you. So this greater conceptual framework, hold tight here, but essentially I wanted to account for a lot of the different influences of travel behaviors and not just land use mixing. And so in the left box there, you have the built environment. And so I categorized it into three different measurements. So you have land development patterns, so that's land use mix and density, but you also have urban design attributes and transportation system attributes. And those influence travel behaviors and patterns. And that, that's mediated by the idea of going through trip distance, influencing our modal decisions. However, it's also important to account for this notion that sociodemographic and economic attributes also influence this travel behaviors or patterns and also the built environments that we choose to live in. So I adopted this framework that was based on the literature to kind of achieve these two different studies. So the first was I wanted to introduce a multidimensional construct of the built environment. So those three different sort of categories of land development patterns, urban design, transportation system. So moving beyond just land use mix. And I wanted to, doing so would allow me to reflect the important tenets of smart growth development and offer some insight into how the measures that we choose in the built environment may be packaged together or bundled. And then I wanted to, having developed this multidimensional construct, test this greater framework that I showed in the previous slide, and through using the structural equation model, link this to pedestrian travel. And so doing so allowed me to simultaneously account for the various and confounding determinants of walking, so not just the built environment, but also looking at these sociodemographic and economic attributes. And doing so would extend our understanding of the link between smart growth development and walking. So because it was a little more complex, I decided I was going to narrow down my study area for the second study. And so I looked at the 3 counties in Oregon that encompass the Portland metropolitan region. So again, I used OHAUS data sets, but here I had just a sample of 4,400 households. Also had information on the sociodemographic and economics of the household. And then I used this built environment data from the previous study, but I extended it to have 62 different measures of the built environment. So a really extensive number of measures to kind of look at the second study. And I operationalized these at the home location. So I looked at what the built environment was within 1 mile aerial buffer of an individual's home. And this distance, based on work of Larry Frank and Nathan McNeil and others, sort of approximates this idea of a 20-minute walk neighborhood. So I think it's a valid way to go forward as far as testing these different built environment measures. So the plan for the second study was, first, you have these 62 measures, and so there's probably some redundancy within them. And so I wanted to just eliminate some of these measures that were replicated. And so I did that just through a basic zero-order correlation analysis. And then I wanted to test how these may be bundled together, so these different attributes, by employing an exploratory factor analysis, hoping to kind of uncover factors that relate to those built environment dimensions of land development patterns, transportation system, and urban design. And then having sort of peeked under the hood of the inner workings of these built environment measures, I performed a confirmatory factor analysis. And so this allowed me, like in the first study, to sort of generate these latent constructs of the built environment. And what's different than this study beyond the extensive set of built environment measures is that I wanted to ensure that it was kept within a framework. So I predicted the factor scores in the first study, but in this one I kept the factors intact by incorporating structural equation modeling. So this allowed me to look at the multi-directional links that were described in that first slide of the study, and then also to simultaneously test for the direct and indirect effects of the built environment on pedestrian travel. Okay, and so what were the results of the confirmatory factor analysis? So 3 different dimensions came out of this effort. The first theme that came out was this factor of employment concentration. And so there were 3 indicators on this. One was increased employment population balance, so a higher number of jobs to individuals within an individual's neighborhood, an increase in office job density and retail job density within the area. So I sort of hypothesized that these 3 indicators describe this idea of employment concentration. A second factor that came out was, once again, this idea of land use mixing. And so it had 3 indicators that were in the first study, but however, because I incorporated more built environment measures, there was the opportunity for other indicators to also be predicted of this construct. And they were employment entropy. So aside from having, a lot of land use, increased complexity in land use composition and configuration, you also wanted to have a diverse array of jobs within an area. And then just the nature of the study area that I selected, so having a lot of sort of rural land in addition to the metropolitan area of Portland, this indicator of maximum patch size dedicated to agricultural land uses shook out. And so this just essentially says that you can't have a big farm within an area if you're going to consider it being mixed land uses. So intuitive, but sort of a silly indicator. So then the third factor that came out of this confirmatory analysis was pedestrian-oriented design. And so this was also indicated by 3 different measures. So an increase in retail land use patches, a higher connected node ratio, so sort of pointing to this traditional street network design, and then a high proportion of sidewalk coverage. So looking back to our overarching conceptual framework for the second study, you can see that these 3 different indicators represented the built environment. And so I had an idea that as I was going into this that I wanted to kind of get at what are the factors of smart growth that influence pedestrian travel. And so it actually came out that this was representative of a second order factor. So each of these were related to each other, and I hypothesized or devised that this represents what I'm calling a smart growth neighborhood. So the smart growth neighborhood being reproductive of employment concentration, high level of land use mixing, and a pedestrian oriented design. So it could also be maybe a walkable community. And then within this multi-directional framework, I linked it to travel behaviors and patterns, so looking at walk mode choice for both transportation-related reasons, so looking at travel for work or school, and then also for discretionary purposes, so social outings, recreational outings, etc. However, I also then incorporated a number of socio-demographic and economic characteristics at the household level, and so household composition, household income, number of workers, educational attainment, and then also access to different mobility options. And then we know that these then are influential of both the built environment and travel behaviors. And so testing all that produced my final model, which had a relatively good fit for being as complex as it is. And so I was pretty happy with how that turned out. And so just to sort of highlight the findings from this second study. So as I pointed out there, I identified a second order factor that described smart growth neighborhoods, and this was based upon employment concentration, land use mixing, and also pedestrian-oriented design. And then I modeled the link from these different objective measures, so these 62 measures that I looked at that broke down to these second order factor within a multi-directional framework. And what I found was that smart growth neighborhood, so residing in one of them, was a strong and significant predictor of the household level decision to walk for both transportation and discretionary trip purposes. So this is a little different than findings that have come up in some meta-analysis recently, but when you bundle together these different ideas of the built environment into one sort of factor, it actually had a stronger magnitude and significance than those socio-demographic attributes. So bundling the neighborhood and accounting for all these different sort of ways that it relates together really was a very strong determinant of the decision to walk. And so the practical implication of this second study, one of which is that the link between walking in areas with these represented by these 3 different areas can help us refocus sort of contentious development discussions. So what I'd like to highlight is that within those different sub-factors of the second order smart growth neighborhood, there was nothing about population density. And so One way that maybe we can help develop walkable neighborhoods isn't just simply upzoning areas, but think about how we're configuring our land uses within an area. So that may be more palatable going forward in sort of discussing how we can improve the efficiencies within the neighborhood level built environment. Okay, and then moving on to this third study. And so this study has not been published. It's going to be currently out for review soon, but in this one, I wanted to operationalize the neighborhood effects of the built environment on travel behavior. So I wanted to look at what's the influence of the geographic scales that we use to represent the built environment when we look at this transportation land use connection. And so borrowing from literature that's out there and sort of moving it forward, I devised a typology for how we can think about geographic zonal systems. And so the one on the left there is this notion of fixed geographic scales. And so this is more often than not what's been used to represent the built environment. And so this is that we have some predetermined boundary and we have information provided at this boundary, and then we just sort of join it to where the individual lives. And so this could be, you know, an artificial boundary like I used in the first study, so a grid cell, or it could be a statistical boundary such as a census tract or census block group. However, you have this problem in that the individual may be more like the surrounding of the individual will be more like this than it may be like something within the boundary. And so there's a lot of reasons why this isn't an ideal way to reflect the built environment. So what researchers have done now for at least the past decade is move towards sliding geographic scales. And so this places the individual or the decision maker at the center of their universe, or the center of their neighborhood. And you can either do an aerial buffer that's as the crow flies, a certain spatial extent, so a mile out, as I did in the second study. Or you can use some sort of impedance factor, such as the street network, and create a network buffer. And then a third system, which I did not use in the study, but carries a lot of merit going forward, is the notion of perceptive geographic scales. And so using the work or extending the work of Kevin Lynch, kind of getting at these mental maps. So really, when people think about their neighborhoods, it's not about, you know, distances or some impedance by the street network, but it's more, you know, some decision that they carry forward into what they think is that they can walk to or that they can drive to. And so I think that carries forth a lot of reasons why we should kind of look into that going forward, but I did not in this particular study. However, the objectives of this third study were to, once again, to measure the environment. So I wanted to look at all these different features that I outlined in the second study, but I wanted to test them at varying geographic zones and then also different spatial extents. And doing so would allow me to provide insight into the impact of the modifiable aerial unit problem. And so this modifiable area unit problem is a commonly understood problem within the geographic field and geography field, and also in transportation land use research, but it deals with the sensitivity of analytic results to the definition of geographic scales that we use to represent spatial data. And then I want to connect this to travel behavior, so I want to investigate the contribution of the built environment at both trip ends, so both the trip origin and the trip destination on mode choice. And I also want to further subdivide this based upon understanding what's the influence of the built environment on home-based work and home-based non-work trips. So for this third study, I narrowed my study sample even further in that I looked at residents of the city of Portland. So it reduced my sample to 3,100 adults from 1,900 households. But I wanted to not set some sort of artificial boundary on where they travel to. So I allowed them to travel anywhere with a home-based trip within the region. So this was 4,700 home-based trips that I analyzed in this third study. In the built environment, I reduced a couple of the measures because they just didn't really make much sense after I conducted sort of that second study exercise. But I measured them at both the home and the trip destination in this third study, and I operationalized them at 12 different geographies. So it's a lot of different measures to sort of look at this transportation land use connection. And so to describe that analysis, so I operationalized the built environment, as I said, at 12 different combinations of zonal system and spatial extent. So within sort of the statistical zonal system, I looked at block groups and tracts, and then using the artificial grids, I had the quarter mile and 1 mile edges to it. So those are fixed geographic scales. And then I looked at also, though, 8 sliding geographic scales, so aerial buffers at the and network bands at the quarter mile, half mile, three-quarter mile, and 1 mile spatial extents. So 12 different geographies that I looked at. And that allowed me to explore this problem of sensitivity to analytic results in both the scaling and zoning effects. And I did that by incorporating discrete choice analysis. So I estimated separate models of home-based work and home-based non-work that accounted for individual household and trip level attributes. And then what I did was I looked at each of the 58 built environment measures and the 12 different spatial extents, and I found what combination of measure and scale best improved the base model's fit, and then I selected that as sort of the winner. And so I used that and produced 58 built environment measures at the origin and another 58 measures at the destination. And then I used those in a stepwise process to produce full models that looked at this relationship. And so just for the sake of showing too much information, I'm only going to show the results of the home-based non-work trip analysis. So the outcome here of interest is travel mode choice. And so the base alternative was whether or not the individual drove their vehicle or was a passenger within this vehicle. And their alternatives were that they could use transit, they could bike, or they could walk this home-based non-work trip. And so I estimated the base model, which included those social characteristics, so gender, age, education, etc., and then also travel characteristics. So here, travel time was a alternative specific attribute, and cost was a generic attribute for a cost associated with driving and a cost associated with using transit. And so I'm just going to show you real quickly some of the measures that came out in the full model, built environment measures of the trip origin. And so there were 6 different measures. Right on space, I'm just going to show sort of the 4 with the greatest magnitude. But they were retail density, measured at a network buffer of a quarter mile, entertainment job density, a network buffer of a half mile, and then 2 different land use mix measures. So what was the maximum patch size of a residential land use, and what was the maximum patch size of a retail land use? And as you can see, these are all sort of reflected at different scales, and so it wasn't just a one size fits all for these different built environment attributes. And so just showing the sort of direction of the relationship, and I'll focus kind of on this last column here, the pedestrian, or the decision to walk rather than drive. And so you can see that an area at the origin that had an increase in retail density and entertainment density, job density, had a positive influence on the decision to walk versus drive. However, if you had an area that had a really large residential contiguous patch of land use, or a really large patch of retail, such as a mall or big box store, this had a negative impact on the decision to walk versus drive. And then at the trip destination, I also had built environment attributes, and so there were 5 predictors here, and the green sort of signifies that they were land use mix related measures, where the blue is that they were part of another factor. And so here in the trip destination, you had an increased number of entertainment related patches, or again, the maximum patch size for retail or entertainment land uses. And then they didn't have as much significance, although they improved the model fit, and so they were kept within the final model. You can see that sort of the origin here, especially for walking, the built environment mattered a little bit more when you're measuring at that side of the trip end, which sort of is in line with previous, and the overall model fit was good. So what were the study findings of this 3rd study? So I explored the scale and zoning effects, the built environment links to mode choice, so that modifiable arrow unit problem. And I came up with just sort of 3 general rules of thumb to going forward so that everyone doesn't have to undertake this exercise that I did. And so the first rule that I propose is that whenever possible, researchers or practitioners should adopt a sliding geographic scale for representing the built environment. So those fixed scales, they have a number of inherent flaws, but also when I was doing this analysis, the sliding scale representations tended to be the one that improved the model the best. A second rule is that prioritizing measurement of the built environment to trip origin seems to matter more. And then the third rule was operationalizing land use mix measures at a more disaggregated spatial extent seems to be the way to go. So those measures of the land use mixing, the patch sizes, were kind of operationalized at a network buffer of a quarter mile or a half mile, or sort of these smaller geographic extents. And so if possible, you should measure those types of measures at the smaller geographic scale. But that doesn't necessarily hold for density measures or other measures. And then looking at the development patterns, so the land use mix and density, they mattered at both trip ends for walking and non-work travel, but as I pointed out, it was a little more indicative of the trip origin. And so the practical implication of this work, I think there are a number, and I'm still sort of fleshing it out, but I think it's important to give a little more deliberation to when we select a geographic scale to look at spatial dependent behavior. So often individuals just want to, or researchers would like to just have the data that's available to them, and so they want to quickly use this and understand what's its impact, and in this case in travel behavior. However, maybe a little more time should be given to understanding what is the contextual factor that we're trying to look at, and how does it really express its actual influence. It's all, but maybe greater thought needs to be given towards what scale we're using to reflect these built environment measures. Okay, and then just to quickly kind of wrap up these three studies, they're all related to one another, but they definitely do also stand alone. But there were some main limitations. With any empirical work, you're going to have limitations. And I just want to point out two of the bigger ones within this study design. And so the first of which is that my travel behavior data were cross-sectional. And so although in the second study, I used structural equation modeling to get at some of the multidirectionality of these relationships, without having a longitudinal data set, I can't really establish a time precedent. So I can't say that changes to the built environment cause increased pedestrian travel. And that's just a shortcoming of this work. Another one is that I did not explicitly account for the statistical bias that results from self-selection. So this is that idea that individuals choose to live in areas where they can express the travel behaviors that they'd like to. You can account for this, again, with longitudinal data or preference data. There's other ways to get about it with instrumental variables, but I did not explicitly account for this in the study, and so it's just another limitation. However, there are some important contributions. I pointed out some of the implications as I was presenting each individual study, but overall, I believe that I contributed to the evidence base by deconstructing and redeveloping land use mix as a multifaceted construct with indicators founded in activity-based transportation and landscape ecology theory. So using theory to really drive why it is we're selecting these environment measures and really understanding it, how they work, was a contribution of this dissertation. And then I hope I advanced travel behavior research by recognizing and exploring the need for improved methods to conceptualize and operationalize the built environment. So structural equation modeling hasn't been used a lot, but it's gaining traction. And then also this notion that we should think about different scales when we're measuring the influence of the built environment on our different outcomes of interest. And so there are other contributions that I could go over, but I think those are two big ones to highlight. And then just one final sort of concluding thought on this work is that, and this kind of goes into how I was summing up the third study, but I think there needs to just be greater thought into how does the built environment influence behavioral processes. So it's not enough just to continue to use these measures such as the entropy measure to measure land use mix unless we really understand what it is we're measuring and link it back to some sort of theory for understanding what are the behavioral processes that we're trying to unearth. So with that, I thank you for your time. I know that's a very technical presentation, but yeah, I open up to any questions that there may be.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve. Great presentation. For those of you viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. It looks like we have a question already queued up, so start there. Regarding the first round of results in your study one, did the inclusion of your new land use measure reduce the explanatory power of any of the other variables, looking for collinearity among independent variables?
Yeah, and so there was, I think, having sort of that, let's see if I can get back to the results of that. Maybe they're pointing to, so I think they're talking about the second analysis within there. And so, yeah, and so I think what happened a little bit was that my land use mix construct had an intensity measure or was a composition measure that looked at the number of residential or retail land use patches in an area. And I think that did take away a little bit of what the population density or even employment densities explanatory power would be. I don't know that for sure because I don't have sort of the iterative model results in front of me, and I sort of blocked out a lot of those analyses from my mind at this point. But I do believe it sort of took away a little bit of the explanatory power of those. So there might be a little multiplanarity, but you know, I think it's hard, and I kind of try to address these in the second study, is that these measures don't really stand alone. They work, you know, in tandem with one another. So just measuring an ideal density independent of design is pretty difficult.
Great, thank you. All right, did you experiment with differences in results between square fishnets versus hexagonal tessellations for your zone-based land use mix statistics?
I didn't. No, I would have, I mean, I looked at the 12 different geographies, and there's a lot more sort of other spatial scales that could be used. I don't know, maybe the hexagonal could perform better as a fixed geography than the grid cells, but I didn't really look at that in the study. I chose the sort of 66-foot grid cells for that first study and then aggregate them up, and that kind of came out of the idea that I could maybe use this work within Metroscope or other local land use tools that kind of grab grids instead of looking at hexagonal grids or hexagonal shapes.
Great. I really appreciated the practical implications after each study that you had highlighted. I was curious, have you worked with any developers or any other studies with some of those practical implications yet?
I haven't. You know, I've now since moved over from Portland State. I'm a senior research analyst now in Boston at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council here. And so there has been some interest in trying to think about how, sort of from that first study, there isn't a lot of green development opportunities here in Boston, but there are a lot of infill opportunities. And so the idea that you would be able to sort of specify what is the right land use to go into that area to get at maybe walkability or looking at other outcomes, so economic development and stuff like that. And so I haven't directly tested that, but there has been a little interest in that, and I'm definitely welcome to if there's any viewers out there that would like to sort of adopt this work to try to employ it somewhere.
Great, that's great. All right, another question from the audience. When looking at the data, is there anything that will compensate for physically placed barriers that divide neighborhoods, such as the new freeways or other, sorry, just lost the question. Such as new freeways or other types of barriers to AT that planners would have some input in the frequency of crossing types, etc.
Could you just repeat again the very beginning of it one more time? Sorry.
Yeah. So when looking at the data, is there anything that will compensate for physically placed barriers that divide neighborhoods, such as freeways?
Yeah, and so I guess with the area or with the network bands, I did sort of have, I accounted for, if that's what the question is, sort of did I account for these natural barriers? So with the grid cells, I did not, it's just cast it over. I didn't sort of dissolve water features or major highways that would sort of already impede. And I didn't do the same either for aerial buffers. And so this isn't normally done to my understanding anyhow, but you know, there are, the way of statistical boundaries like block group and census tracts, they do usually follow around road networks, so they do account for that a little bit. And then within my network band, I specifically looked at, you know, operationalizing built environment measures along sort of these street networks. So that does incorporate some sort of physical barriers. But I, you know, as I kind of alluded to in that first slide, see if I can pop over to it, but where I was showing the different geographic extents, you know, moving forward, something that I had thought I would maybe look into, and then my committee said, no, that's way too much, was this perceptive geographic scales. And so, you know, that individuals have these barriers with how they view their surrounding environment. And so it's important to incorporate those. So I think moving forward, that'd be something I'd like to look more into if that's a theoretical and empirical improvements about how we bound sort of our spatial measures.
Okay, great. And then we have one attendee who asked if you could provide more information or resources, point to resources to learn more about indexes for configurations such as contingent indexes.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think there's paywalls behind me just publicly sharing it, but I can email along my journal article that describes sort of how those measures were computed. There's also some of those are borrowed directly from, as I mentioned, landscape ecology research. So it's just, in landscape ecology, they look at configuration in a different way in that you don't want to have an area that's broken up. You want to have these sort of contiguous stretches of land for habitat protection. But if you think of that in land use mixing, inversely, we want areas that are really broken up, and so we can kind of get these origins and destinations closer to one another. And so if you kind of going through landscape ecology research, there's a lot of these metrics that I borrowed from. And then also, which I didn't go over, was in the lit review where I really discussed more about sort of the shortcomings of current measures. That's in a Journal of Transport and Land Use Research paper that I can pass along because it's open source that I co-authored with my advisor, Kelly Clifton. And so that gets a little bit more into what are some of the shortcomings of measures and specifically describes the composition and configuration aspects.
Great, thank you for that. All right, and we have another question from an attendee who, as a sociologist, issues of race, gender, as intersecting identities that may impact behavior, and in this case, spatial behavior. So she asked whether this climate change in land use can also be further analyzed on a level that goes further. We can draw travel behavior, land use, etc., by race, class, gender. So trying to make that connection, I guess, with racial implications.
Yeah, and I think that's extremely important. And so I haven't looked much into that, but obviously I think that that's going to be an important way to sort of look at this relationship of transportation land uses, sort of what are the implications, but also, what is sort of the current landscape. And I know that Arlie, who went to Portland State recently, came out with a journal article which looked at incorporating some of this stuff, but I haven't read enough up on it. But I think that his understanding was there haven't been many studies, at least from the urban planning field, that have sort of looked at that angle of the understanding the implications of land use mixing or the built environment in relationship to active travel. So yeah, so I think there are ways that this could be used going forward to kind of understand sort of those other aspects of transportation land use, but I haven't specifically looked at it.
Okay, great. So it looks like that wraps up the questions that we have from the attendees. All right, and so this concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, Stephen, for your presentation and for sharing your work. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. You can also view other professional development offerings on our website, nitc.trek.pdx.edu. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.